Welcome back to Sleepbound. Last time, we entered the grand world of Downton Abbey, where a tragic telegram changed everything. Now, in tonight's chapter, the family and staff begin to grapple with the consequences. Who will inherit Downton? Can the future of the estate be secured? And what tensions are stirring below stairs? As always, settle in, get comfortable, and let the quiet drama of this world carry you into sleep. Chapter 6. Family Matters. In the drawing room, Violet, Dowager Countess of Grantham, stood by the fire, dressed from head to toe in black. Her posture was rigid, her bearing regal, her expression formidable. "Of course I've heard," she declared as Cora entered. "Why else would I be here?" "Robert didn't want you to read it in a newspaper and be upset," Cora explained, approaching her mother-in-law cautiously. "He flatters me," Violet replied dryly. "I'm tougher than I look." Cora's expression suggested that this would be hard to believe, given the older woman's already formidable appearance. "I'm very sorry about poor Patrick, of course," Violet continued. "He was a nice boy." "We were all so fond of him," Cora agreed, her tone gentle. "But I never cared for James," Violet added matter-of-factly. "He was too like his mother, and a nastier woman never drew breath." Her words effectively put an end to any excessive displays of grief, reminding Cora of the practical matters at hand. "Will you stay for some luncheon?" Cora offered. "Thank you." Cora walked toward the bell pull by the fire. "I'll let Carson know." "I've already told him," Violet stated. "Shall we sit down?" Clearly, she had business to discuss. "You agree this changes everything," she said once they were seated. For once, Cora was surprised to find herself in agreement with her mother-in-law. "My words entirely." "Do you know the new heir?" Violet inquired. "Only that there is one." "He's Robert's third cousin once removed," Violet explained. "I have never, to my knowledge, set eyes on him." They both understood the true subject of their conversation. "Of course, if I hadn't been forced to sign that absurd act of legal theft by your late husband," Cora began, old resentments resurfacing. Violet bristled momentarily, but quickly regained her composure. "My dear, I haven't come here for a fight." Cora fell silent, curious now about the purpose of this unexpected visit. "Lord Grantham wanted to protect the estate," Violet explained. "It never occurred to him that you wouldn't have a son." "Well, I didn't," Cora replied flatly. "No, you did not." This had clearly been a source of tension between them in the past. But when Patrick had married Mary, and your grandson been hailed as master, honor would have been satisfied, Violet continued. "Unfortunately, now a complete unknown has the right to pocket my money along with the rest of the swag," Cora finished bitterly. "What does Robert say?" Violet asked, her shrewd eyes assessing Cora carefully. "Nothing yet. He's too upset." "Good," Violet nodded. "Don't let him come to a decision until we can be sure it's the correct one." Cora began to protest, but Violet raised her palm to silence her. "The problem is, saving your dowry would break up the estate," Violet stated plainly. "It'd be the ruin of everything Robert's given his life to." "And he knows this?" Cora asked. "If he doesn't, he will." "Then there's no answer," Cora concluded, defeated. Violet leaned forward slightly, her eyes glinting with determination. Yes, there is, and it's a simple one. The entail must be smashed in its entirety, and Mary recognized as heiress of all. There's nothing we can do about the title, Cora pointed out. No, she can't have the title, Violet agreed. But she can have your money, and the estate. I didn't run Downton for 30 years to see it go, lock, stock, and barrel, to a stranger from God knows where. Cora regarded her mother-in-law with new understanding. Are we to be friends then? Violet hesitated, unwilling to go quite that far. We are allies, my dear, she replied carefully, which can be a good deal more effective. In the servants' hall, lunchtime had arrived. Carson addressed Bates, the newcomer to their midst, his tone carrying the weight of tradition and expectation. Downton is a great house, Mr. Bates, and the Crawleys are a great family. We live by certain standards, and those standards can at first seem daunting. Of course, Bates began, but Carson continued, uninterrupted. If you find yourself tongue-tied in the presence of his lordship, I can only assure you that his manners and grace will soon help you to perform your duties to the best of your ability. I know. Bates tried again, but was cut short by a familiar voice from the doorway. Bates, my dear fellow. Robert stood in the doorway, his expression brightening at the sight of his old comrade. The stunned company struggled hastily to their feet, showing proper deference to the master of the house. Only then did Robert realize he had interrupted their meal. I do apologize, he said quickly. I should have realized you'd be at luncheon. Not at all, my lord, Carson assured him. Please sit. Sit, everyone, Robert insisted. I just want to say a quick hello to my old comrade in arms. Bates, my dear man, welcome to Downton. It was only when Bates struggled to his feet that Robert fully registered his disability. The momentary flicker of surprise in his eyes was quickly replaced by warmth as he took the valet's hand. I'm so sorry to have disturbed you all, Robert said, addressing the room once more. Please forgive me. After he departed, the table remained silent, all eyes fixed on the newcomer. Bates shrugged slightly, looking around at their curious faces. You never asked, he said simply. O'Brien caught Thomas's eye across the table. Their exchange was brief but laden with meaning. Neither was pleased by this development. In the kitchen, Mrs. Patmore and her staff were working at full speed, preparing the luncheon. The heat from the range had turned the room into a furnace, beads of sweat glistening on the cook's forehead as she barked orders. Thomas, take that up, she commanded. The footman loaded a pie onto a tray with Daisy's help, the kitchen maid's eyes lingering on him a moment too long. Leave that, Daisy, Mrs. Patmore snapped. He's a grown man. I suppose he can lift a meat pie. Now put the apple tart into the low oven. Daisy smiled up at Thomas as he hurried out. Mrs. Patmore noticed a bowl on the sideboard and frowned. And take that away, she instructed Daisy. Mr. Lynch shouldn't have left it there. What is it? Daisy asked, peering at the white crystalline substance. Salt of sorrel. I asked him for some to clean the brass pots, Mrs. Patmore explained, but there's no time until the luncheon, so put it somewhere careful. It's poison. Daisy picked up the bowl, surveying the many waiting dishes with a thoughtful expression. It seems a lot of food when you think they're all in mourning. Nothing makes you hungrier or more tired than grief, Mrs. Patmore said, her tone softening slightly. When my sister died, God rest her soul, I ate my way through 4 platefuls of sandwiches at one sitting and slept round the clock. Did it make you feel better? Daisy asked. Not much, Mrs. Patmore admitted, but it passed the time. As Daisy took a step toward the scullery, Mrs. Patmore let out an exclamation. Oh my lord, what was this chopped egg supposed to be sprinkled on? She held up a bowl of egg from the table, looking expectantly at Daisy. Was it the chicken? Daisy suggested hesitantly. It was. Take it upstairs now. Daisy's eyes widened in alarm. I can't go in the dining room. I should think not, Mrs. Patmore agreed emphatically. Find Thomas or William. Tell them what to do. When Daisy still hesitated, Mrs. Patmore's patience wore thin. For heaven's sake, get a move on before they get back from church. Chapter 7. Memorial and Mourning. Outside Downton Church, people in black were emerging from the memorial service. Among them was a sober-looking lawyer, George Murray, walking alongside Robert. Well, we've given them a memorial in London and a memorial here, Robert remarked. I don't know what else we can do. I think it's gone off pretty well, all things considered, Murray replied. I prefer memorials to funerals. They're less dispiriting. We could hardly hold a funeral without the bodies, Robert pointed out, his tone somber. It was right to bury Mr. Crawley in Canada, Murray said. In fact, I hear the Canadians are making quite a thing of the Titanic cemetery. Robert shook his head slightly. It seems strange to have buried James without Patrick. They may still find some trace of him. After 3 months? Robert's expression was skeptical. I doubt it. No. I'm afraid Patrick was food for the fishes long ago. He sighed heavily, the weight of the tragedy evident in every line of his face. I'm surprised at the number they found, Murray commented. You'd think the sea would have taken more of them. They didn't all drown, apparently, Robert replied, his voice dropping. They froze to death in their life jackets. Hundreds of corpses, men, women, and children, bobbing on the surface of the ocean. He shook his head again, the horror of the image too much to contemplate further. As they approached the house, walking across the manicured grounds, Robert turned the conversation to more practical matters. So, Murray, what have you to tell me about the lucky Mr. Crawley? Nothing too terrible, I hope. I've only made a few inquiries, but... No, there's not much to alarm you, Murray assured him. Matthew Crawley is a solicitor, based in Manchester. Manchester? Robert repeated, unable to mask his dismay. Manchester, Murray confirmed. His special field is company law. Really? Robert's tone suggested this information did little to reassure him. His mother is alive, and he lives with her. His father, obviously, is not. He was a doctor. I know. Robert nodded. It does seem odd that my third cousin should be a doctor. His unconscious prejudice was evident, causing slight offense to the lawyer. There are worse professions, Murray replied stiffly. Indeed, Robert agreed, though his tone lacked conviction. At the base of the service stair, Daisy waited anxiously until she spotted William coming down. Do me a favor, she pleaded. This should have been sprinkled on the chicken. But isn't there more to go up? William asked, his fair brow furrowing. Please, It won't take a moment. Give it here, William conceded, taking the bowl from her outstretched hands. As he turned to go back up, Daisy's shoulders sagged with relief. In the gardens, Robert and Murray continued their walk toward the house entrance. We ought to talk about the business of the entail, Murray suggested. Shall we do it after luncheon? Robert proposed, clearly reluctant to face the topic immediately. Can we tackle it now? There's not much to be said on the subject. Something in Murray's tone told Robert these words weren't a good sign. His expression grew more serious as they continued walking. As you know, on your death, the heir to the title inherits everything except for the sums set aside for your daughters and your widow, Murray stated. Yes, Robert acknowledged. Owing to the terms of her settlement, this will include the bulk of your wife's fortune. Robert sighed. It has been our sole topic of conversation since the day the ship went down. Of course it must seem horribly unjust to Lady Grantham, Murray said sympathetically, but that is how the law stands. Is there really no way to detach her money from the estate? Robert asked, his frustration evident. Even to me, it seems absurd. Your father tied the knot pretty tight, Murray replied. I'd say it's unbreakable. I see. The consolation must be that if you did extract the Levinson money, Downton would collapse. You mean it could only be achieved by massive selling? It would be impossible for your heirs to remain here, Murray confirmed. A bitter thought struck Robert. He turned to Murray with a wry smile. I can hardly question that, since I could not have stayed here if I hadn't got hold of the Levinson money in the first place. His emotions had broken through his usual reserve, revealing more than he'd intended. As they reached the house, Robert strode inside, leaving the lawyer to make his own way in. Behind them, Mary, Edith, and Sybil walked in silence. Edith made a point of wiping her eyes, prompting a sharp response from Mary. Really? Do you have to put on such an exhibition? She's not, Sybil defended her sister. I was supposed to be engaged to him for heaven's sake, not you, Mary continued, and I can control myself. Then you should be ashamed, Edith replied, hurt and anger flashing in her eyes. Without waiting for a response, she walked quickly into the house, leaving her sisters behind. Daisy returned to the kitchen, still holding a bowl, her expression troubled. Come on, girl, get a move on, Mrs. Patmore urged, passing her with a hot serving dish. She paused, eyeing the bowl in Daisy's hands. Oh, and don't tell me you've not sent up the egg. Daisy looked down at the bowl she was carrying and froze in horror. Without a word, she spun around and raced back the way she had come. At the base of the service stair, Daisy trembled with terror when Gwen appeared. Oh God, help me. Please, God, help me, she pleaded. What on earth's the matter? Gwen asked, alarmed by the kitchen maid's distress. Just run upstairs to the dining room and find William, I beg you. I can't do that now. You've got to, Daisy insisted, her voice rising in panic. I'll be hanged if you don't. What? As Daisy moaned with fear, they heard a familiar voice from the stairs. Daisy? Is that you? William appeared around the bend, holding a bowl. Is it the chicken in a sauce, or the plain chicken with sliced oranges? Daisy nearly collapsed with relief. Oh, thank you. Blessed and merciful Lord, thank you." She rushed up to him and swapped the bowls. "The chicken in the sauce." A bemused William nodded and returned upstairs as Daisy clutched her hands together in fervent gratitude. "I'll never do anything sinful again. I swear it. Not till I die," she vowed, hurrying back to the kitchen and leaving a puzzled Gwen behind. Chapter 8. Legal Matters. In the hall, Robert stood with Murray as other guests began to file past them, nodding and smiling sadly as they made their way to the dining room for luncheon. "Lord Grantham says you're not staying after all," Cora inquired of the lawyer, a note of surprise in her voice. "You're very kind, Lady Grantham, but I must get back to London," Murray replied with a slight bow. "But you'll stay for luncheon?" she pressed. "Thank you, but no. I'll eat on the train," he declined politely. "In fact, if you'd be so good as to ask for the motor to be brought round." Cora frowned slightly. "I thought you wanted the afternoon to talk things through." "I think we've said everything we have to say," Murray replied carefully. "Haven't we, my lord?" He looked to Robert for confirmation, a subtle tension passing between the men. "For the time being, yes," Robert agreed. "Thank you, Murray. You've given me a good deal to think about." Cora studied her husband's face, searching for some hint of hope in his expression. The girls lingered to one side, equally curious. "Mary, try to get everyone into the dining room," Cora instructed, turning to her daughters. "And Edith, make sure old Lord Minturn sits down." Chapter 9. Upstairs and Downstairs. In Carson's pantry, the butler was engaged in the delicate work of decanting port. He had stretched gauze across a silver funnel and positioned a candle behind the flow of wine as he poured, watching with satisfaction as the liquid pooled clear and ruby bright. Mrs. Hughes stood nearby, observing his meticulous process. "They've all gone, then?" she asked. "They have, thank the Lord," Carson replied, his relief evident. "What about the lawyer?" "He was the first away. Didn't even stay for the luncheon," Carson informed her, his disapproval barely concealed. Mrs. Hughes sighed. "I wish they'd make their minds up. Gwen's put clean sheets on the blue room bed. Now she'll just have to strip it again." "Can't you leave it for the next guest?" Carson suggested. "Only if you don't tell," she replied with a hint of mischief. They shared a brief laugh, a moment of camaraderie between two people who had worked side by side for so many years. "So, has it all been settled?" Mrs. Hughes inquired, returning to the matter at hand. "No, I don't know that anything's been settled," Carson answered, his brow furrowing. "There's a fellow in Manchester with claims to the title, I gather, but it's all a long way from settled." "You mustn't take it personally," Mrs. Hughes advised gently. "I do take it personally, Mrs. Hughes," Carson replied with unexpected fervor. "I can't stand by and watch our family threatened with the loss of all they hold dear." "They're not our family," she reminded him, her tone gentle but firm. "They're all the family I've got." Carson's voice rose sharply, surprising them both. "I beg your pardon," he added more quietly, regaining his composure. Mrs. Hughes regarded him thoughtfully. "Do you ever wish you'd gone another way?" He looked at her, puzzled by her meaning. She shrugged. "Worked in a shop or a factory? Had a wife and children?" "Do you?" Carson asked, deflecting the question back to her. I don't know. Maybe. Sometimes. Her voice held a wistfulness she rarely allowed herself to express. A knock at the door interrupted their moment of candor. Gwen appeared in the doorway. Williams laid tea in the library, but her ladyship hasn't come down, she reported. Oh, she'll be tired, Mrs. Hughes reasoned. Take a tray up to her bedroom. Is Thomas back? Carson inquired. Not yet, Mr. Carson, Gwen replied before departing. Carson looked to Mrs. Hughes, seeking understanding. He asked to run down to the village. I didn't see why not. I suppose they do realize this is a job, and not just the chance to put their feet up, Mrs. Hughes remarked with a hint of exasperation. Both sighed, sharing in the weight of their responsibilities. In the library, Robert stood alone by the fire, staring into the flames, his thoughts clearly far away. The door opened softly, and Edith entered, closing it behind her. Are you all right, Papa? She asked, concern evident in her gentle voice. I suppose so, Robert replied wearily. If being all right is compatible with feeling terribly, terribly sad. Me too, Edith whispered. He opened his arms and embraced her, finding comfort in his middle daughter's empathy. We loved Patrick, didn't we? He said softly. Oh, Papa, Edith replied, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. She cried against his shoulder, her grief genuine and unrestrained. Robert patted her back soothingly, his own eyes shadowed with sorrow. Well, well, life goes on, he said at last, helping her regain her composure. Edith wiped away her tears, taking a deep breath. What did Mr. Murray have to say? Only that I have some very difficult decisions ahead, Robert admitted. You must do what you think right, Edith assured him. I may not have an option. No, I only mean... Edith hesitated, then pressed on. You should do what you feel is your duty, not just what's best for Mary. Realizing how revealing her words were, she quickly added, or Sybil, or me. We'll manage. Of course you will, Robert agreed, though he had not missed the brief glimpse into his daughter's feelings regarding her elder sister. In Cora's bedroom, O'Brien helped her mistress into a relaxing tea gown as Gwen departed, having delivered the tea tray. It's iniquitous, O'Brien declared, her fingers deftly fastening the delicate hooks of the gown. They can't expect you to sit by silent as your fortune is stolen away. Can't they? Cora replied, her tone resigned. His lordship would never let it happen, O'Brien insisted, watching her mistress carefully. Cora declined to comment on this sensitive topic. She stretched out on a daybed, taking up a book from the bedside table. O'Brien poured the tea, the delicate china cup clinking softly against its saucer. How's Bates working out? Cora asked, changing the subject. Well, O'Brien began, her hesitation deliberate. I don't like to say. Cora looked up from her book, her interest piqued by the lady's maid's reluctance. Only it seems unkind to criticize a man for an affliction, milady, O'Brien continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. When Cora made no comment, O'Brien pressed her case. Even if it means he can't do his job. This final comment caught Cora's attention, her expression shifting as she considered the implications of O'Brien's words. Chapter 10, Bonds of Service. In the library, Robert sat at his desk, pen in hand, though he seemed more preoccupied with his thoughts than with whatever he was writing. Pharaoh lay contentedly by the fire, the only sound in the room the occasional crackle of burning logs. The door opened, and Bates appeared. "Mr. Carson said you wanted me, my lord," he said. "Yes, Bates," Robert replied, looking up from his papers. "I thought I'd have a bath before I change tonight. I'll come up before the gong." "Very good, my lord." Bates turned to leave, but Robert stopped him. "So, how are you settling in?" "Very well, I think," Bates answered, "unless your lordship feels differently." "No complaints?" Robert asked, his tone casual, but his eyes searching. "If I had any, I should take them to Mr. Carson, my lord. Not you." Robert chuckled appreciatively at being put in his place. "You're probably right." Still, something troubled him. "And the house hasn't worn you out, with the endless stairs and everything?" "I like the house," Bates replied simply. "I like it as a place to work." Robert nodded, emboldened by their exchange. "What happened?" "It's only the old wound," Bates explained, his voice matter of fact. "After I left the army, I'd a spot of bother, and just when I'd got through that, about a year ago, my knee started playing up." With a wry laugh, he gestured with his stick. "A bit of shrapnel was left in or something, and it moved, but it's fine. It's not a problem." Robert's troubled expression revealed his concern, though he tried to lighten the moment. "We've seen some times, haven't we, Bates?" "We have, my lord," Bates agreed, the simple words carrying the weight of shared experiences neither man cared to discuss openly. "And you'd let me know if you felt it was all too much for you?" Robert asked, a shadow of worry crossing his features. "I would," Bates assured him, "but it won't be." Their eyes met in mutual understanding, the bond between them transcending their roles as master and servant. In the park, Thomas walked along the drive toward the house, his tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sky. The grandeur of the estate spread out before him. Ancient trees, sweeping lawns, and at its heart, the magnificent house itself. Yet his expression remained unimpressed, as though he viewed it all as nothing more than the backdrop to his own ambitions. As he entered the kitchen courtyard, O'Brien's voice called out to him, "And where have you been?" She sat on a low window ledge, a cigarette held between her thin fingers. Wisps of smoke curled around her severe features. "The village," Thomas replied, "to send a telegram, if you must know." "Ooh, pardon me for living," she retorted, though her tone suggested no real offense. She offered him a cigarette, which he accepted. Despite their barbed exchanges, these two were clearly allies in the complex hierarchy of the servants' hall. "Well, Murray didn't stay long," O'Brien remarked. "Does her ladyship know how they left it?" Thomas asked, leaning against the wall beside her. "Number they talked it all through on the way back from the church." Thomas took a long drag on his cigarette. "If I was still his valet, I'd get it out of him." "Bates won't say a word," O'Brien predicted, rolling her eyes. "He will not," Thomas agreed. "I'd bet you a tanner he's a spy in the other direction." O'Brien shuddered with distaste. Thomas glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "I wanted that job," he admitted. "We were all right together, his lordship and me." "Then be sure to get your foot in the door when Bates is gone," O'Brien advised with quiet determination. Thomas raised an eyebrow at her assumption. We can't get rid of him just because he talks behind our backs. There's more than one way to skin a cat, O'Brien replied with a knowing wink that promised trouble to come. Chapter 11. Sisters at Odds. In Mary's bedroom, Anna was dressing Mary's hair for dinner as Edith and Sybil looked on. All three sisters were dressed in black evening clothes, the somber attire at odds with the elegance of their surroundings. Perhaps she misunderstood, Anna suggested, her fingers working deftly through Mary's dark tresses. No, it was quite plain, Mary replied. O'Brien told her Bates can't do the job properly. Why was he taken on? He was Lord Grantham's Batman when he was fighting the Boers, Anna explained, securing a pin in place. I know that, Mary said dismissively, but even so. Sybil, ever the romantic, smiled softly. I think it's romantic. I don't, Mary countered, her expression hardening. How can a valet do his work if he's lame? He's not very lame, Anna defended, putting the finishing touches to Mary's elegant coiffure. There. She gathered up a few items to take downstairs. Anything else before I go down? No, that's it. Thank you. Mary dismissed her with practiced courtesy. As the maid departed, Mary examined her reflection in the glass, grimacing at her black skirt. Oh, I hate black. It's not for long, Sybil reassured her. Mama says we can go into half mourning next month, and back to colors for September. It still seems a lot for a cousin, Mary remarked. But not for a fiancé, Edith interjected, her tone pointed. A momentary silence fell over the room. He wasn't really a fiancé, Mary said at last, her voice cool. No, Edith challenged. I thought that was what you call a man you're going to marry. Mary's eyes narrowed slightly. I was only going to marry him if nothing better turned up. Mary, what a horrid thing to say, Sybil exclaimed, shocked by her sister's callousness. Edith would have taken him, wouldn't you? Mary turned to her middle sister, her words deliberately provocative. Yes, I'd have taken him, Edith admitted, raw emotion breaking through her usual reserve. If you'd given me the chance, I'd have taken him like a shot. The uncomfortable atmosphere prompted Sybil to attempt to diffuse the tension. Might something better turn up? We'll have to wait and see, Mary replied enigmatically. We'll have to wait and see if he comes to the boil, Edith added, her words loaded with meaning. He will. Don't you worry. He hasn't yet. Who? Who hasn't? Sybil asked, confusion evident in her young face. Mary ignored her youngest sister, focusing her attention on Edith. Things are different for me now. How do you know? Edith pressed. Has Papa told you things are different? Suppose he can't make them different. He can and he will, Mary asserted confidently. It's not like when it was all going to Patrick. Papa won't give everything to a man we've never even heard of. And you're happy to catch him in that way? I don't care how I catch him, Mary declared, a flash of steely determination in her eyes. In what way? Who? What's changed? What things are different? Sybil asked, frustrated at being excluded from her sister's cryptic exchange. But Mary and Edith merely shared a knowing look, leaving their younger sister's questions unanswered. In the kitchen passage, Carson walked briskly along the corridor as Thomas attempted to catch his attention. I just think you should know it's not working, Mr. Carson, Thomas said, his tone deceptively concerned. It's been going on for 3 months now, and it's not working. Do you mean Mr. Bates is lazy? Carson asked, his pace slowing slightly. Not lazy exactly, Thomas clarified, but he just can't carry. He can hardly manage his lordship's cases. You saw how it was when they went up to London for the memorial. He can't help with the guests' luggage neither. And as for waiting at table, we can forget that. And what do you want me to do? Carson asked, his expression guarded. It's not for me to say, Thomas replied with false humility. But is it fair on William to have all the extra work? Carson made no immediate comment, but Thomas could see his point had landed. I don't believe you'd like to think the house was falling below the way things ought to be, he added, knowing exactly which buttons to push. I would not, Carson agreed, his pride in Downton's standards evident. That's all I'm saying. Carson sighed heavily, the weight of yet another concern settling on his shoulders. In Mary's bedroom, Sybil stood by the door, ready to go downstairs. I'm going down. Coming. In a moment, Mary replied, still seated at her dressing table. You go. Sybil hesitated, then crossed the room to stand beside her eldest sister. I know you're sad about Patrick, whatever you say. I know it. You're a darling, Mary said, with unexpected tenderness, taking her sister's hand and kissing it gently. But you see, I'm not as sad as I should be, and that's what makes me sad. With a melancholy smile, she released Sybil's hand, a rare moment of vulnerability that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Sybil emerged from Mary's room and walked down the gallery toward the staircase. She paused when she spotted Edith standing motionless before a collection of framed photographs. What's the matter? Sybil asked. Edith started, then quickly composed herself. Nothing. Sybil's gaze fell on the object of her sister's attention. Among a group of silver-framed photographs on a chest was one of a smiling young man, not handsome, but pleasant-looking. Patrick Crawley, whose death had altered all their futures. Poor Patrick, Sybil murmured. Yes, poor darling Patrick, Edith echoed, her voice suddenly warm and genuine as tears began to course down her cheeks. Sybil wrapped her arms around her sister. You're the poor darling. I know how you'll miss him. More than he'd miss me, Edith replied bitterly. Nonsense. He was devoted to you. Do you think so? Edith asked, a flicker of hope in her tear-filled eyes. Of course, Sybil assured her. He loved us all, and we loved him. This wasn't what Edith had wanted to hear. Her expression hardened slightly. Not Mary. She never cared for him. Not really. That isn't true, Sybil protested. You heard her, Edith insisted. She's more upset about wearing black than she is about him dying. I just hope... What? I hope one day she learns what it feels like to be unlucky. Oh, dearest, you don't mean that, Sybil said, shocked by the venom in her sister's words. But as Edith dried her tears and straightened her shoulders, her expression suggested that she meant every word. Chapter 12. Difficult Decisions. In Robert's dressing room, the Earl stood in white tie, the pinnacle of evening formality. Bates brushed his tailcoat with meticulous care. Thank you, Robert said. As Bates bent to pick up something from the floor, Robert instinctively moved to assist. "I'll do that." "No," Bates replied sharply. Realizing his tone, he softened. "No, thank you, my lord. I can do it." "I'm sure." "I hope so," Bates said earnestly. "I hope you are sure." Robert sighed, the weight of a difficult decision evident in his posture. "Bates, we have to be sensible. I won't be doing you a favor in the long run if it's too much for you. No matter what we've been through, it's got to work." "Of course it has, sir," Bates agreed, then quickly corrected himself. "I mean, my lord." The slip reminded Robert of their shared history, of bonds forged in circumstances far removed from the refined elegance of Downton. "Do you miss the army, Bates?" he asked quietly. "I miss a lot of things," Bates admitted. "But you have to keep moving, don't you?" "You do, indeed." "I'll show you, my lord," Bates promised with quiet determination. "I won't let you down. We've managed so far, haven't we?" His earnest plea moved Robert deeply. After a moment, the Earl nodded. "Yes, we have. Of course we have." In Cora's bedroom, the Countess was putting the finishing touches to her appearance when Robert entered. O'Brien gathered the discarded undergarments and slipped discreetly from the room. "You look very nice," Robert complimented his wife. "Thank you," Cora replied, watching him in her dressing table mirror. When Robert offered nothing more, she turned to face him. "Did Murray make matters clearer?" "Yes, I'm afraid he did," Robert admitted, though he clearly had no intention of elaborating. Cora pinned a brooch to her gown, then casually remarked, "By the way, O'Brien says Bates is causing a lot of awkwardness downstairs. You may have to do something about it." "She's always making trouble," Robert dismissed. "Is that fair when she hasn't mentioned it before now?" "I don't know why you listen to her," Robert said, irritation creeping into his voice. "It is quite eccentric, even for you, to have a crippled valet," Cora observed. "Please don't use that word," Robert winced. "Did he tell you he couldn't walk when he made his application?" "Don't exaggerate. But doesn't it strike you as dishonest not to mention it?" "I knew he'd been wounded." "You never said?" "You know I don't care to talk about all that," Robert replied, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. Cora studied her husband's face, trying to understand. "Of course I understand what it must be like to have fought alongside someone in a war." "Oh? You understand that, do you?" Robert's sarcasm was biting. "Certainly I do," Cora persisted. "You must form the most tremendous bonds, even with a servant." "Really? Even with a servant?" Robert cut her off, his voice sharp. Cora bristled at his tone. "Oh, Robert, don't catch me out. I'm simply saying I fully see why you want to help him." "But?" She shrugged slightly, treading carefully. "Is this the right way, to employ him for a job he can't do, when he needs special treatment at every turn? Is it any wonder if the others' noses are put out?" "I just want to give him a chance," Robert said, though doubt had begun to creep into his voice. "I won't be long," Cora said, as Robert headed for the door. "I'm going down," he replied, leaving her to her thoughts. Thanks so much for joining me tonight. I hope this story has brought you a little peace and relaxation. As always, feel free to drift off whenever you're ready.
Did I make the most of loving you? So many things we didn't do. Did I give you all my heart could give? To unlived lives with lives to live. When these endless lonely days are through, I'll make the most of loving you. I'll make the most of loving you. Did we make the most of all we had? Not seeing you makes my heart sad. Did we make the most of summer days? We still have time to change our ways. When these endless lonely days are through, I'll make the most of loving you. 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 Did those tender words stay in my head? So many things were left unsaid. Did I give you all my heart could give? To unlived lives with lives to live. When these endless lonely days are through, I'll make the most of loving you. I'll make the most of loving you.